Christine, how much does it hurt the WNBA when Caitlyn Clark is out?
It is devastating to the WNBA when Caitlyn Clark is out.
I know a lot of us were expecting some sort of dip since Caitlyn Clark has been out with injury, but I don't think all of us were expecting the entire viewership of the entire WNBA to be down. And this tweet from Brennan really stuck out to me. She said one player gets injured and more than half the TV audience for the entire league disappears. Has any other athlete ever had that kind of impact on a sport? Golf without Tiger definitely dropped precipitously on occasion.
Imagine building the most valuable skyscraper in your city's history, watching millions of people flock to admire it, generating record-breaking revenue from the tourism alone, and then systematically allowing vandals to chip away at its foundation while pretending nothing was wrong. That is precisely the situation the WNBA finds itself in right now, and the numbers do not lie. When Caitlyn Clark steps off the court due to injury, more than half of the entire WNBA's television audience disappears. Not just fans of the Indiana Fever, not just Clark's personal followers. More than half of every single viewer watching every single game across the entire league simply stops tuning in. Veteran sports journalist Brennan posed the question that every honest analyst has been asking behind closed doors. Has any other athlete in the history of professional sports ever had that kind of singular seismic impact on an entire league? The answer, after careful examination of the data, the history, and the financial consequences, is both fascinating and deeply troubling. Because while Clark's impact is undeniably extraordinary, the WNBA's response to that impact has been nothing short of catastrophic mismanagement on a scale that professional sports organizations rarely survive. This is the full story of how one player changed everything, how a league refused to protect what it had been gifted, and how the consequences of that refusal are now being measured in millions of dollars, plummeting ratings, and a future that grows more uncertain with every game Caitlyn Clark misses. To fully understand the crisis unfolding within the WNBA, you first need to understand the scale of what Caitlyn Clark brought to the league when she arrived. Before Clark, the WNBA was a league that most casual sports fans could comfortably ignore. Games drew modest television audiences. Tickets were affordable because demand was manageable. Corporate sponsorship was consistent but far from explosive. The league existed, it survived, and its dedicated fan base appreciated it. But it was not must-see television, and it certainly was not a cultural phenomenon. Then Caitlyn Clark arrived, and everything changed almost overnight. Suddenly, WNBA games were being rescheduled to larger arenas to accommodate demand. Tickets that once sold for a few dollars were fetching prices that rivaled NBA playoff games. Television networks that had treated WNBA broadcasts as filler content were now seeing ratings that made executives sit up and take notice. The Indiana Fever, a franchise that had spent years in relative obscurity, became one of the most talked about teams in professional basketball. Clark did not just raise the profile of the Indiana Fever. She raised the profile of every team in the league, because every game involving Clark became a spectacle, and every game not involving Clark became a referendum on whether the WNBA had substance beyond its newest star. The data that emerged when Clark was first sidelined with a left quad strain answered that referendum with brutal honesty. During the 5 games Clark missed earlier in the season, the WNBA's national television viewership dropped by more than 50%. To be precise, when Clark was playing, the average viewership across nationally televised WNBA games sat at approximately 1.81 million viewers. When she was absent, that number collapsed to roughly 847,000 viewers. That is not a minor adjustment. That is not the kind of fluctuation that sports analysts typically explain away with scheduling conflicts or competing programming. That is a structural dependency so profound that it redefines how we think about an individual athlete's relationship to their sport. Indiana Fever games specifically saw a 53% drop in viewership when Clark was unavailable. But the fact that the decline extended to the entire league, not just to Fever games, tells the more significant story. Fans were not just tuning in to watch Clark play. They were using Clark's presence as their signal that the WNBA was worth their attention at all. Without that signal, more than half of them simply found something else to do with their time. Ticket prices told an equally stark story. Games featuring Clark commanded prices that placed them among the most valuable tickets in all of women's professional sports. Some Clark game tickets reached $860 per seat, with the average price hovering around $1,370 for the most anticipated matchups. When Clark was ruled out, those same tickets dropped to as low as $80. Tickets for games that had originally listed for $860 were suddenly available for $200.
And the truth is the truth, and the data is there. And what we saw when Caitlyn was out the last time, the 5 games that she missed earlier in the season, the WNBA's viewership dropped more than 50%. Not just the Fever, but the entire league.
$150, a 71% decline. The Lowe's Angels Sparks rematch. one of the most anticipated games of the season, saw tickets fall from $210 down to $95 after Clark's availability was called into question. That particular game, when Clark did appear, drew an audience of 2.25 million viewers, making it one of the most watched WNBA games in recent history. Remove Clark from the equation, and it becomes, in the words of those who have analyzed the situation closely, just another game that casual viewers have no compelling reason to watch. These numbers are not projections or estimates. They are documented, verified facts that paint a picture the WNBA can no longer afford to ignore or explain away. Here is the part of the story that makes the financial devastation so much harder to accept. Every single element of this crisis was foreseeable. The writing was on the wall from the moment Clark's popularity began transforming the league's economic landscape. The WNBA had a blueprint directly in front of them for how to handle a once-in-a-generation superstar, and they had ample warning about what would happen if they failed to follow it. When Clark first arrived in the league, she was notably humble about her impact. She consistently deflected praise toward her teammates, she acknowledged the legacy of the players who came before her, and she handled the extraordinary pressure of being the most scrutinized rookie in women's basketball history with a maturity that genuinely impressed seasoned sports observers. She gave the league every opportunity to embrace her without controversy. The opportunity was right there. The WNBA had a young, charismatic, extraordinarily talented player who was driving the kind of revenue and viewership growth that leagues spend decades trying to manufacture artificially. They could have surrounded that investment with the appropriate infrastructure, clear player protection rules, consistent officiating standards, a proactive approach to managing the competitive environment to ensure that their most valuable asset remained healthy and productive. Instead, what followed was a series of incidents that can only be described as a league allowing its single most important economic driver to be systematically targeted with impunity. Hard fouls that went unchecked, physical confrontations that referees declined to address with appropriate seriousness, a pattern of behavior from certain opponents that many observers characterized not as competitive basketball, but as deliberate intimidation of the one player the league could least afford to lose. The Phoenix Mercury were particularly prominent in this discussion. Analysis of the league's most flagrant fouls revealed that the Mercury were responsible for 80% of the league's 30 most egregious fouls on Clark, with 5 of those occurring within a compressed time frame. These were not the incidental physical contacts that happen in any competitive basketball game. These were the kinds of plays that in other professional leagues would trigger immediate reviews and significant disciplinary consequences. The WNBA's response was consistent and consistently inadequate. League officials characterized the incidents as basketball plays. They used language about competitive balance and letting the players play that sounded reasonable in isolation, but felt deeply disingenuous given the specific pattern emerging around one specific player. The message being sent, whether intentionally or not, was that the league either could not or would not intervene to protect the player responsible for the majority of its growth. Sports journalist Brennan, one of the most respected voices in the field and the author of the upcoming book on her game, Caitlyn Clark and the Revolution in Women's Sports, was direct in her assessment of the league's failures. Her commentary following Clark's most recent injury cut to the heart of the issue. The WNBA continues to fail to meet the moment. When more people are watching than ever before, this is what they see. They see the league's biggest star getting taken out with injuries that many medical professionals and sports analysts have linked to the physical wear and tear of repeated hard fouls and inadequate protection. Medical experts who have followed Clark's injury history have raised specific concerns about the relationship between her initial quad strain and the subsequent groin injury. When an athlete suffers an injury to one area and attempts to compensate for that weakness, the stress frequently transfers to adjacent muscle groups. The progression from quad injury to groin injury follows a pattern that sports medicine professionals recognize as a direct consequence of compensation mechanics. What this means in practical terms is that Clark may have been playing through discomfort before the groin injury became severe enough to force her off the court, and the physical nature of the game she was experiencing may have significantly accelerated that progression. The recommendation from those in the medical and sports science community was clear. If protecting Caitlyn Clark means sitting her out for 3 weeks, if it means she misses the All-Star game, then that is the appropriate course of action. Short-term losses in ticket revenue and television ratings are recoverable. A serious long-term injury to the player generating 26.5% of all WNBA economic activity is a catastrophe from which the league might not recover at all. The financial consequences of Clark's injuries extend far beyond the immediate drop in television ratings. They ripple outward through every dimension of the league's economic ecosystem in ways that are only beginning to be fully understood. Start with the league's baseline financial situation. The WNBA was already projected to lose approximately $50 million during this season, even with Clark's presence driving unprecedented growth. That figure becomes dramatically worse when Clark is absent, and every revenue stream tied to her presence contracts simultaneously. Television contracts are affected because viewership numbers directly influence the value of broadcast.
Clark went down. The WNBA ratings have dropped over 55% across the board.
Hey, guess what, guys?
League is Caitlyn Clark.
The league is Caitlyn Clark. She is the WNBA, guys.
Sidelined with a left quad strain May 24th, national TV viewership has plunged since then 55%. Before the injury, Fever, her team, were averaging 1.81 million viewers, almost 2 million. Since her injury, fewer than 850,000.
Broadcast agreements. Sponsors who committed significant marketing dollars based on Clark-era viewership projections are now watching those numbers fall off a cliff during her absences and asking legitimate questions about whether their investment makes sense at a reduced scale. Merchandise sales, which had been transformed by Clark's popularity, stagnate when the player whose name and number are driving those purchases is not actively in the public eye competing. Road game venues that had been upgraded to larger arenas specifically to accommodate the surge in demand for Clark appearances are now sitting with excess capacity they cannot fill. That is not just a loss of potential revenue. That is an active financial burden, because larger venues come with larger operational costs. The economics that made sense when Clark was filling those buildings become deeply problematic when she is absent and attendance reverts to pre-Clark levels. The broader economic calculus becomes even more alarming when you consider the timing. This season occurs at a critical moment in the WNBA's labor negotiations. The league's collective bargaining agreement is up for renegotiation at the end of the current season, and the outcome of those negotiations will determine the financial reality for every player in the league for years to come. Player salaries, benefits, travel accommodations, and working conditions are all on the table. The Clark-driven boom was supposed to be the WNBA's strongest argument for significantly improved player compensation. The logic was straightforward. Here is proof that the league generates substantial revenue. Here is evidence that the audience exists and is growing. Here is the foundation for paying players what professional athletes at this level deserve. But when viewership drops 55% during Clark's absence, that argument becomes substantially more complicated. Owners and league executives who might have been prepared to acknowledge the new financial reality under Clark-era conditions now have a very different set of numbers to point to when discussing what the league can and cannot afford. The players who are counting on improved CBA terms are, in a very real sense, being financially harmed by the same toxic environment that has repeatedly put their league's most valuable asset at risk of injury. The irony is painful and the math is unavoidable. When sports analysts attempt to contextualize Caitlyn Clark's impact on the WNBA, the comparison that comes up most frequently is Tiger Woods and professional golf. It is a reasonable starting point because Tiger's influence on golf's popularity was genuinely transformative in ways that the sport still feels and benefits from today. When Woods was absent from tournaments due to injury or personal circumstances, television ratings for golf dropped noticeably. Networks and sponsors understood that Tiger's presence was a significant variable in their audience projections, but here is where the comparison breaks down and where the Clark situation becomes uniquely unprecedented in professional sports history. When Tiger Woods missed events, golf's ratings declined. They did not collapse. The sport maintained a substantial audience because golf had decades of tradition, a deeply established fan culture, legendary courses with their own brand value, and a roster of compelling players who could draw their own audiences even without the sport's biggest star present. Tiger made golf better and bigger, but the infrastructure that existed before him and the players who competed alongside him could sustain meaningful interest even in his absence. The same pattern held true for Michael Jordan's impact on the NBA. When Jordan retired or was unavailable, NBA ratings experienced drops, but those drops, by current estimates, were measured in single-digit percentage points. The NBA had Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Charles Barkley, Hakeem Olajuwon, and eventually a generation of stars who had grown up in the Jordan era and could carry audience interest on their own considerable merits. The league had built something durable around its biggest star, something that could survive and even thrive in his absence. The 55% drop in WNBA viewership when Clark is absent represents something categorically different from anything those comparisons can adequately capture. This is not a league that built a sustainable structure with Clark as its crown jewel. This is a league that exists, for a substantial majority of its casual viewership, almost exclusively because Clark exists. The argument can be made, and sports analysts with access to the data are actively making it, that no single athlete in the history of professional sports in America is
As big a deal as Tiger was in men's golf, Keith, he did, and when he was gone, it affected the ratings, but nothing like that. And, Michael Jordan being out, maybe a 5 percentage points or something. Nothing like this. You can make a strong case, and I will make that case, and have that there is no one single athlete more important to his or her sport or tour or whatever the circuit is that they play on than Caitlyn Clark is to the WNBA.
More individually important to the existence and viability of their league than Caitlyn Clark is to the WNBA right now. That is an extraordinary claim. But the data supports it in ways that other extraordinary claims about athletic impact simply do not. Beyond the financial crisis, beyond the medical concerns, there is a credibility problem brewing inside the WNBA that may ultimately prove to be the most damaging long-term consequence of the league's handling of the situation. Fans who watch closely have noticed a pattern that is difficult to explain away as coincidence or competitive basketball. When Clark is fouled hard, the response from officials tends toward inaction or minimal consequence. When Clark reacts to physical play, either by expressing frustration or asserting herself in competitive situations, she is sometimes characterized as overly aggressive or insufficiently gracious about the physicality of the professional game. When she absorbs the contact quietly, she is criticized for lacking the toughness required at this level. There is no version of that dynamic in which Clark can emerge without criticism. The critics who have positioned themselves in opposition to her narrative of success have constructed a framework in which any response she offers becomes evidence for whatever argument they are already committed to making. Play physically and you are the problem. Absorb physical play quietly and you are soft. Succeed brilliantly and it is because the spotlight unfairly follows you. Struggle through injury and it proves you were overrated. This is not a competitive sports environment. It is a cultural trap, and the WNBA's refusal to clearly and consistently enforce player protection rules that would apply equally to every athlete in the league regardless of profile is what allows that trap to persist. The consequence is a fan base that has begun making a conscious choice about how to allocate their viewership. Many Clark fans have publicly stated that they are not simply disappointed when Clark is injured. They are actively choosing not to watch other WNBA games as a form of protest against what they perceive as an environment that is hostile to fair competition when Clark is involved. They question whether officiating is consistent. They wonder whether the league's stated commitment to competitive integrity applies with equal force when the league's biggest star is the one being targeted. When your own fans tell you they do not trust the competitive environment of your league, you have a problem that cannot be solved with better marketing campaigns or expanded broadcast partnerships. You have a fundamental credibility problem, and credibility once lost is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. The NBA faced a version of this conversation in various eras and addressed it by establishing clearer standards for player protection and enforcing them visibly and consistently. The message to every team in the league was straightforward. We protect our stars not because they deserve special treatment as individuals, but because the sport is better when its best players are on the court and fans can trust that the game they are watching is genuine competition governed by consistent rules. The WNBA has not sent that message clearly or consistently, and the fan trust deficit is growing. The path forward for the WNBA requires decisions that should not actually be difficult, but that, given the league's track record, may prove to be exactly that. The first requirement is simple in concept, though it demands consistent follow-through. Protect the players who generate the league's revenue and audience with the same rigor that any serious professional sports organization applies to its most valuable assets. Establish clear, transparent, consistently enforced standards for what constitutes dangerous and unacceptable physical play. Apply those standards without regard to which team is committing the foul or which player is receiving it. Communicate those standards clearly to teams, players, and fans so that everyone understands what the expectations are. The second requirement involves a more fundamental shift in how the league thinks about its identity and its narrative. The WNBA cannot simultaneously aspire to be a major professional sports league with the credibility and infrastructure that designation implies, while also allowing the kind of social media-driven controversy and manufactured drama that currently surrounds its biggest games. Professional leagues are defined by competitive integrity. When that integrity is questioned, everything else the league is trying to build becomes shakier. The third requirement is the most difficult because it demands
game because of the way they play the game. Because I love the WNBA. I love the way they play the game. But we really watch it because Caitlyn Clark and everybody watching. Now listen, if I keep bumping her, knocking her down, might get her a concussion, you might hurt her for real. For 2 weeks, she was done with like a hamstring. She was down. 55% of the viewership was down. She comes back the next game, it's about 3 million viewers. Now let me tell you something. Growing up in the hood, they teach you this. Always protect the money. Y'all keep hurting her and all that. She's going for a year or two. Ain't nobody gonna watch it. If nobody watches, how y'all gonna make and generate money?
Genuine honesty about the current situation. The WNBA needs to publicly and clearly acknowledge what every data point is telling them. Caitlyn Clark has done something extraordinary for this league, and the appropriate response is gratitude, protection, and a commitment to building the kind of sustainable infrastructure that will allow her impact to compound over time, rather than being repeatedly interrupted by preventable injuries and corrosive controversy. This does not mean Clark should be treated as above criticism or immune from competitive play. It means the league should manage its most valuable economic relationship with the professionalism and strategic intelligence that relationship deserves. The financial stakes are real and immediate. With CBA negotiations on the horizon, with sponsorship decisions being made, with broadcast deals up for reassessment, the WNBA is in a period where the decisions it makes right now will shape the financial reality for every player in the league for the next several years. The players who have worked their entire careers to reach this level deserve a league that is managed with their long-term interests in mind. Right now, the league's management of the Clark situation is actively working against those interests. It is worth stepping back from the specific percentages and dollar figures to understand what the viewership collapse during Clark's absences actually represents at a human level. Those 847,000 viewers who watched WNBA games without Clark are not nothing. They are a dedicated fan base that values the sport on its own merits, appreciates the skill and athleticism of every player in the league, and would continue watching regardless of which individuals are on the court on any given night. That audience deserves to be honored and grown. But the 1.81 million viewers who watch when Clark is playing represent something different. The majority of them are casual sports fans, people who are interested in athletic excellence and compelling competition but who have not historically had a reason to make the WNBA a regular part of their sports consumption. Clark gave them that reason. Her combination of extraordinary skill, competitive charisma, and the cultural moment she represents brought millions of people to women's basketball who had never seriously engaged with it before. The question every sports league asks itself about a moment like this is, how do we convert these new viewers into long-term fans? How do we ensure that the casual interest generated by a specific star becomes a genuine investment in the sport itself, one that persists even when that star is unavailable? The answer historically has always involved the same fundamental ingredients. Give those new fans a reason to trust the competition they are watching. Give them other players they can appreciate and root for. Give them narratives and storylines beyond the singular draw that brought them in initially. Create an experience consistent enough in quality and integrity that even when their primary draw is absent, they see enough value in the overall product to stay engaged. The WNBA has talented players who could serve these functions. The league has stories worth telling beyond the Clark narrative. But none of that secondary structure can develop in an environment where the foundational trust is broken, where fans feel that the competition is not being managed with integrity, and where the league's actions consistently communicate that it does not fully understand what it has in Caitlyn Clark or how to build something lasting around it. The 55% viewership drop is not just a rating statistic. It is a measurement of how many people came to the WNBA because of Caitlyn Clark and have not yet found a reason to stay when she is not there. That gap is the single most important strategic challenge the league faces, and it cannot be closed while the environment around Clark remains this unstable. What makes this conversation particularly striking is how broad the consensus has become. This is not a debate confined to sports analysts or media personalities with established positions on Clark and the WNBA. It extends to everyday sports fans, community voices, and people who bring genuinely diverse perspectives to the question. The commentary emerging from fans of all backgrounds reflects a basic common sense about economic reality that sometimes escapes institutional leadership. The observation that has resonated most widely is as clear as it is direct: always protect the money. If you keep putting your most valuable asset at risk, eventually you will lose that asset, and once it is gone, all the audience and all the revenue disappear with it. That is not an observation about Caitlyn Clark as an individual. That is fundamental business logic applied to professional sports. The players in the WNBA understand this, even if they express it differently. Every player whose salary will be determined by the upcoming CBA negotiations has a direct financial interest in Clark remaining healthy, productive, and generating the viewership and revenue numbers that make improved compensation possible. The league's inability to protect its biggest star is not just bad for Clark. It is bad for every player who has been waiting for women's professional basketball to reach a financial threshold where the compensation actually reflects the athletic excellence being displayed. The fans who have committed to boycotting WNBA games without Clark are exercising the only form of influence available to them. Their viewership numbers are the currency the league uses to negotiate broadcast deals and attract sponsors. When those fans withhold that currency in protest, they are making a statement about accountability that the league is finding impossible to ignore, even if it has not yet found the appropriate way to respond. History will likely judge this period in WNBA history as a defining moment, one way or another. Either it will be remembered as the moment the league recognized what it had, made the structural and cultural changes necessary to protect and grow it, and built something genuinely durable and valuable on the foundation Clark's arrival created. or it will be remembered as the moment a professional sports league had an opportunity to transform itself and squandered it through short-sightedness, political timidity, and an inability to prioritize its own long-term health over short-term comfort. The league's average viewership in games without Clark this season sits at approximately 555,000 viewers, which is actually lower than the 670,000 average from the prior year. That is a number that represents a return to pre-Clark conditions, and it suggests that the audience Clark brought to the league has not been converted into durable fans of the sport. They came for Clark. When Clark is not there, they leave. And now they are leaving in larger numbers than before Clark arrived, suggesting that the contrast between the Clark experience and the non-Clark experience has actually made the league's baseline feel less satisfying rather than more. That is the paradox at the heart of the WNBA's current crisis. Clark's presence has made the league more visible, more discussed, more financially significant, and more culturally relevant than it has ever been. But her absence has made the league feel smaller than it did before she arrived, because now everyone knows what it can be, and the version they see without her falls short of that standard in ways that feel newly obvious. Breaking that paradox requires building a league that is genuinely stronger at every level because Clark was part of it, not a league that simply oscillates between boom and bust depending on one player's availability. That building work requires time, investment, and decisions that prioritize long-term sustainability over short-term convenience. The clock on making those decisions is not unlimited. Every game Clark misses due to preventable injury, every fan who walks away feeling that the league does not deserve their trust, every sponsor who reconsiders their commitment in light of unstable viewership numbers represents an opportunity cost that compounds. The window in which the WNBA can use Clark's impact to build something truly lasting is open right now, but window's close. The story of Caitlyn Clark and the WNBA is ultimately a story about whether a professional sports league can recognize the magnitude of what it has been given and respond with the wisdom and urgency that gift demands. The numbers are unambiguous. No single athlete in modern American professional sports history exercises the kind of singular gravitational pull on an entire league's existence that Clark currently exerts on the WNBA. A 55% drop in viewership when she is absent is not a statistic. It is a reckoning. The league has been handed an extraordinary opportunity, a player who genuinely transformed women's basketball from a sport that casual fans respected but rarely prioritized into must-see television that breaks records and commands serious cultural attention. What the WNBA does with that opportunity in the months and years ahead will determine whether women's professional basketball achieves the sustainable, well-compensated, fully respected future its players deserve, or whether it looks back on the Clark era as the moment it had everything it needed and still found a way to come up short. Protect the player, protect the investment, protect the future. The data has spoken. The question now is whether anyone in a position of authority is truly listening. Because if they are not, the 55% drop we are seeing today may prove to be merely a preview of a far more permanent collapse, one that no amount of marketing brilliance or broadcast deal restructuring will be able to reverse. The WNBA's greatest crisis is also its greatest opportunity. Which one it becomes depends entirely on the choices it makes right now.